image that, or can you like do some kind of, I don't know, PHP monkey patching for it? Or would you just write your own homepage beneath that and have everything inherent, like the base of what you write?
So if I followed correctly, if you want to override methods that were implemented here, you simply implement them yourself here with identical names. And say,
I'm saying, like, do you have to have your own base thing that everything else inherits from? Because everything already inherits from the CI controller.
So short answer, no. No, you don't need any additional layer of hierarchy unless you find that you have this controller, this controller, this controller, this controller, and you find over time that, man, every one of these controllers has a foo method and a bar method. Let me factor those out by interposing in this family tree of controllers a middleman like that that has that base functionality. But again, we'll come back to this type of design next time. But that's definitely an option. All right, so let's clean this up. And we do that in version 10 here. So in version 10, we have a slightly different structure. And let me just open the README, which already shows a little cheat sheet of the files in here. Almost all of this is the same, right? We've got our same templates at the bottom. We've got our home page up there. And notice at the top, though, notice at the top under controllers, I've introduced a separate controller now, one called lectures and one called labs. So let me actually go in there and see what's different this time. So first, in application, in config, in routes, notice that I've cleaned up the mess that I was starting to make. And I call it a mess because if you have to hard code half a dozen or more routes, there's got to be a cleaner way of doing this. And so sure, I'm going to go back to the original, and I'm just going to rely on CodeIgniter's default mechanism of /foo/bar/baz. So in my controllers now, notice I have a few controllers here. In welcome.php, I just used the same name this time rather than come up with an arbitrary homepage.php file. The only thing this welcome page does is it displays my main menu. So it displays a header, then the index, then the footer. So that's identical to what we had before. And those links include labs, lectures, and sections. So just to be clear, if I go into version 10 here, what we see is that. So that's all that's inside of that view called index.php. And just to be super sure on the same page, if I go into views and I go into welcome, index.php, that's all that's there. That's where that came from. All right, so the interesting part and the step forward this time is that now I have a lectures controller. And this is much closer to a good solution now to this problem. So class lectures extends CI controller. Why do you need that? It's just so that the whole system works together, among whose features will be index will get called automatically for us. So in the index method, notice we're doing the same thing as before. But this time, I'm opening the lectures/index file as the contents of this page. And then notice I ditched the lectures method. I decided this was a little sloppy, and so I'm going to tweak my URL scheme a little bit now to be consistent with CodeIgniter's defaults, and my function called lectures will still take a argument n so that we can pass it in to that template in this way. And again, just to make clear that there's really no magic here, in the index page, that's all that's there. It's still hard-coded, so there's still a little more room for improvement, certainly, in that I don't want to be hard-coding all this HTML every week. But if I now go into the lecture page, notice it is fairly like what it was before. So ugly URL, but it's just mapping to deterministically predictable URLs on our CDN server. Echo n is dynamically spitting out the number of the lecture, so we can get the right PDF and video. All right, so in the end, what does this version look like? Well, if I go to lectures, notice the URL at the moment is, let's call it /, because this is just messiness as the result of having so many examples in one lecture. So let's click lectures. Notice it changes to lectures. And now notice with lecture 0, it changes to be a little longer than before. We had slightly shorter URLs, but now it's a little clearer that foo, bar, and baz in this case are the lectures controller, the lecture method therein, and 0 is just an argument that's passed in. Any questions? All right, so what are we? Yep.
Yeah, so if your website's really big, you have a lot of links hard-coded in your HTML templates, right? Is there a way to abstract that out and tell CodeIgniter to generate that URL from your controller?
Indeed. So if you actually look at CodeIgniter's helpers class in its documentation, there's a number of methods related to URLs, one of which will give you the base URL of the whole project. But realize it was deliberate that I hard-coded the CDN links because those are on a different server altogether. All of my other links were actually relative. So it should be pretty portable. Other questions? Yeah?
What happens if your method takes more than one argument?
Good question. So the CodeIgniter folks have decided it would just be /0/x/y/z. You separate them by slashes. So you see this a lot, frankly, in blogging software and whatnot. When you have /year, /month, /date, it's the same idea that they're leveraging. Yeah?
These are always for gets, right?
These are for gets or could be for posts. They will be routed to the same controllers. Yeah?
Is there a way to only have, for instance, just the ID of, or the number of the lecture and not have any additional arguments show up in the URL?
So absolutely. We could really, you mean something like this?
Well, no, ask the question like, what happens if you have more arguments? You said they would just keep being appended as more.
You could do something like that, yeah.
But could you, if I had X, Y, and Z arguments, could I just have it show up as /0? Do you have to have all those slashes after?
Oh, no. So if you route it properly,
Right.
if X, Y, and Z are optional, then no, you would not need just ugly placeholders there just because.
Okay.
At this point, things get a little messy, though, to be honest. And what folks will typically do then is start to resort to traditional get or post parameters that would actually not just have this arbitrary slash convention. Yeah?
If you do use a traditional post, can both the controller and the view access it?
If you use it, short answer, yes, because index.php, which is CodeIgniter's main controller, will receive that request irrespective of it being get or post, and it will still route it accordingly, and it will pass it the contents of get or post. All right. So the biggest gap here is that really I have been using CP all the time to make each of these demos. And every week that there's a new lecture, I've got to go into these HTML files, the various views, and add yet another link and yet another link. So there's already an opportunity here to factor out that hard coding, actually use the M in MVC like a database. So let me propose that I'm going to go ahead and open up, let's say, a localhost /phpMyAdmin. Inside of the appliance, I'll log in as jharvard, password crimson. And in advance, I actually went ahead and created this jharvard lecture 2 database as an aside. As the online documentation says, any databases jharvard makes have to be called jharvard_something for access rights. And I'm going to propose, just to keep it super simple, a lecture is going to be a table that looks like this. All right, it's got an ID, which uniquely identifies it. It's just going to be an integer, and it's got a name, which might very boringly be lecture 1, lecture 2, but in theory, it could be lecture 1, HTML5, or something to that effect. So we have that duality. And then under labs, we have the exact same idea, where we have an ID and a name. And what I went ahead and did is pre-populate this just so we have a working demo where labs has a lab 1 and lab 2, and lectures, if I clicked over, has the same thing. So in short, our data is now in a database, not in an HTML file. So how do we go about implementing the M in MVC, and how does this all sort of transcend CodeIgniter itself? So here is version 11, and the last version of these very underwhelming course website demos. So notice, for reference, I included a MySQL directory. Totally arbitrary. This is not functionally related to CodeIgniter, but what I did so that if you want to play around at home, I did a export or a MySQL dump of the database we just looked at in phpMyAdmin. So it's in there. So if you've never seen these before, it just looks like a whole bunch of SQL queries along with some fancy SQL queries related to collation types and so forth, but it's the white and yellow text that's mostly of interest there. So all that does is create the structure that I had there. And for those unfamiliar, how do you import a SQL database into something like phpMyAdmin? You can use the import tab, right? You probably used that before, or at least the export tab. Or you can sort of do it the real way, whereby there is a MySQL command line client called MySQL, and this is available on most any system that has a MySQL database. The usage is typically -u for the username, like jharvard. -p means I will have a password for you. It's best not to put it here, because otherwise, why would you not put it there? So it gets logged in my history, and in fact, if you have nosy neighbors on the same system who are running commands like ps for process list or any number of other commands that show you what everyone else on the system is doing, well, they could, in that split second of time that your command is running, they can see what password you are using. So never should you include passwords on the command line if anyone else has access to the system. And what database do I want to use? Well, I want to use the lecture 2 database that I created in advance. And then if I want to import the contents of that SQL file into this database, well, it's going to wrap onto 2 lines here. So let me do this on a separate line. MySQL-U, jharvard-p, jharvard_lecture2, and then input redirection. So you might remember this from 50 or similar, but you have the ability, jharvard-lecture2.sql. This will run the command on the left, and it will pass it as standard input, the content on the right, and it will even prompt you if you need to for the password. It doesn't exist because now I'm in the wrong directory. Then I could type crimson and hit enter. And so we'll actually see the command line client in a bit when we look at more sophisticated problems that arise with SQL in particular, called transactions and locks that help solve.